Good afternoon. I'm Eric Johnson, until recently, director of this association. And now I'm the director of the Port of Tacoma, which is a really interesting job. I've got my hands full, but I'm mostly having a good time. Welcome to the world of public port districts. You all have been elected now in your local communities. Congratulations. You're going to have fun. It's going to be interesting, and you're going to learn some stuff. So, congratulations. If you haven't held office before, you're about to learn some things that are going to seem a little bit frustrating and unnatural, but be patient. Like any job, it takes a while to learn and master this one, and bear with us, and you'll get there. So here's some basics. I always start with this line. The least powerful person at a port is a single commissioner. The most powerful thing at a port is a unified port commission. By yourself, you can't do anything. But with allies, you can do everything. Almost. There's some limits on that. But the power of a commission is exercised through the meetings of and discussion amongst commissioners. And almost always, those discussions occur in public. There are a few exceptions which you'll learn about. So your job is to set a vision and a broad policy for the direction of the port. And the policy that you set is carried out by the staff of the port. Now, some of you are at very, very small ports, and you may not have staff, which is a separate category. You're still a port. You have all the powers of every port, but not all of you, I don't believe, have staff, but some of you are from fairly big ports. So the most important job that you have is to hire and subsequently direct a port director. If you have staff, you have a port director. And the most important job that you have is to supervise that person, hire them if needed, and supervise them subsequently. And when you do that, you need to have a plan. What is the plan for the port? So, here's some phrases that you're going to learn a little bit about. The official development plan of a port, even if you don't have a harbor, is called a comprehensive scheme of harbor improvements. Other people plan, ports scheme. Remember that. It's a very old phrase. Ports actually are one of the oldest governments in the state who have been directed with planning. Ports were given the authority to develop a comprehensive plan way, way back in the 1910s, way before land use planning became a popular thing. The people who set up our system of governance wanted to know, what are you going to do with all this power that we've given you? We're going to create these port districts. We're going to give you a lot of authority. We're going to give you a lot of autonomy, but we're also going to give you accountability. You have to be accountable to the voters. And we have a really interesting history that I'll talk about in a minute. It's actually important to know where you are by understanding how you got to where you are. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But then you also need to have, in addition to a port plan, which we'll talk about in a minute, you need to have what's called a delegation of authority resolution. Sometimes that's called a master policy, but it's officially called a delegation of authority resolution. And what that does is it says, you don't want to do everything. You don't want to order cans of paint and manage the flower pots and all that kind of stuff. So you delegate authority to the staff to do a certain number of things. And the delegation of authority resolution, which your port has, you'll be inheriting it. You can amend it if you can talk your colleagues into that. Sets forth what the port director can do without commission approval. That's the second key document. The third key document is the budget, which is approved every year. You have a one-year budget at a port district. And then you have an organization chart, presumably, because you have staff. Those are the kind of the things to find quickly. So, what are we? I'll start by saying we're very unique. I used to refer to us as platypuses because we're an animal that shouldn't actually exist. We have all kinds of strange powers and authorities that really don't fit together, except they do. And so what we actually are legally are municipal corporations, as distinct from, say, a county, which is a division of the state. But we are incorporated like a city is. And in our state, you're called a special purpose district. There are different kinds of special purpose districts. The one that you are most familiar with is a school district. You all know what a school district is and what they do. Washington loves government. Washington loves local government. And we have lots of different layers of local government in Washington state. Cemetery districts, hospital districts, public utility districts. and my favorite, of course, port districts. This is a little bit unusual for ports to be organized like this nationally. In most of the areas of the country, they don't have offices like yours that are established the way yours are. In most of the states, the port is a division of the state, it's a state agency, or it's a division of the city. So in Oregon, the Port of Portland the commissioners are appointed by the governor. In California, the ports down there are divisions of the city that they're in. So the city of Los Angeles, the Port of Los Angeles is actually a division of the city of Los Angeles. We don't do that up here. In some places, regional group of cities will get together and form a regional port authority. That's how they do it in New York and New Jersey. That's how they do it in San Diego. But up here, you are special. What is so special about you? Well, if you've seen one port, you've seen one port. But the primary thing the primary focus that you have is to promote economic development. Economic development means different things to different people. And we can talk about that as well. And you guys will have your own vision of what economic development looks like. But fundamentally, we're enterprise units of government. Enterprise units meaning we get to get involved in enterprises and see if we can make money doing it and helping things out. But one of the things that's very nice about ports, and you guys are lucky in one regard, port districts get to choose what they want to do. If you think about it, very few units of government get to decide what they want to get involved in. If you're a school district, you have got a job. You have got mandates and you've got students to teach. If you're a hospital district, you've got to run a hospital. If you're a county, you've got to manage all the stuff that counties do, criminal justice, transportation, all those issues. And you have to do it whether you want to or not. But ports get to pick what you want to get involved in. And that is not typical. That is not typical of most units of government. And it's a luxury that you need to really kind of enjoy. So what we really represent is community investment in long-term assets. We're about community control of important assets like a waterfront or a harbor or an airport or an industrial area. So your community has some set of assets or land that the port owns and controls. And the port district's job is to manage those assets over a long period of time with a long-term vision for your community. That's what every port has in common. From a little tiny port in Kitsap County that has a dock all the way up to the Port of Seattle and the Port of Tacoma. What they all have in common is you have a set of community assets and your job is to manage them for the public over the long term. And fundamentally, we do that by building and operating facilities that foster trade, most obviously, but also other kinds of economic development. And for the most part, ports do 4 different things. Your port probably won't do all 4. There's only a few ports that do all 4. But what we have is marine terminals. That's the seaport. That's the first thing you think of. That's the obvious one. I think that's the Port of Olympia there in the top left. 16 ports have shipping terminals. Airports, which people tend to forget, but SeaTac Airport, for example, is run by the Port of Seattle. Many of the other airports in the state are run by port districts, not all of them. Some other fairly large ones that are not run by ports include Spokane, which doesn't have a port district. Yakima is run by the city. Painfield up in Everett is run by the county. It's not run by the Port of Everett. So those are exceptions. But many of the major airports in the state, including lots of little tiny GA airports, general aviation airports, are operated and run by port districts, 31 of them around the state. Recreational marinas and docks down below, that's a very, very common thing for ports to get involved in. Lots of ports have got marinas, boat harbors, facilities for fishing boats. That also includes kind of public access areas, shoreline trails, viewing towers, parks, that kind of thing. That's quite common. 41 of the ports in the state have got those facilities. And then industrial areas, which is a catch-all term. It's land that's zoned for industrial uses, and the port has put in infrastructure and is trying to convince private investment to come in and create jobs. Those are often associated with airports, but they are not always. And so these ports are located all over the state, and there's more of them than you think. There are more ports in Washington than there is in any other state in the country by a long shot. If you cut it in half, we'd be first and second place. There's 75 ports in the state of Washington. And we engage in more kinds of activity. And what's really unique about us is you, because you're directly elected. So two of the things that are really unusual about your system of responsibilities is your autonomy. You can do what you want, as I mentioned, and your accountability. You have to be accountable to the voters and also to the state auditor's office, which you'll hear about later on, I guess. But you can't go do anything you want. There are limitations, of course, but you can do a lot. So it's the largest locally controlled port system in the world. And as you know, you are directly elected. Most of the ports in the state have 3 commissioners. 5 of them have 5 commissioners, so it's easy to remember. 5 have 5. All the other ones, all the other 70, have 3. The 5 that have 5, by the way, are Seattle and Tacoma, who are mandated by law to have 5. Anacortes, Edmonds, and Orcas Island, way up in the San Juans, have voted, the citizens have voted to go to 5. You can put it on the ballot if you get enough signatures, or the county wants to. You can put it on the ballot and you can go from 3 to 5. And some ports have put that on the ballot and it has failed, by the way. It tends to not be a popular thing to do. It's failed recently in Port Angeles and in Everett and one other place. Most of you have 4-year terms, but most of you actually have 6-year terms. Numerically, most of you have 6-year terms, but some of you have 4-year terms. There's a long story to that I won't get into. And you're always elected in the odd-numbered years. And your job is to, as I said, set the vision and establish the broad accountability. So you can get paid. So right now, if you have revenues over $25 million a year, you get paid $713 a month. And if you're between $1 million and $25 million a year, you get $285 a month. The reason for the odd numbers is because it originally started out at 250 and 500, and they indexed it to inflation. So when you index it to inflation, and that's every 5 years, that it gets reset. And so it's been reset 3 times since it was originally indexed. That's why you get those odd-looking numbers. However, you can also, if you want a different number, you can set a different salary for this. The port can set, with a vote of the majority of the commission, can set a different salary. Several ports have. You can pick any number you want. Any number you want. Except you can't collect it until you've been reelected. The state constitution prohibits mid-term pay changes. So anybody that, whatever salary you get when you first got elected has to stay that way for the remaining, your first term in office. That's for every elected official in the state. That's not just for ports. So you can also get paid, the Latin phrase is per diem. You get a per diem reimbursement for a day that is spent on port business, $128 a day, and there's a maximum, there's a ceiling that you can't exceed in a year. And as I said, that was indexed every 5 years. Oh, and by the way, you're probably going to ask, if you think about it, what's the definition of a day spent on port business? How do you know if I go to one meeting, does that count? Does it have to be all day long? How do I decide that? The answer is every port should have a policy that determines that. Somewhere at your port, you should have a policy that says this is what we consider constitutes a day of business. So if you get one phone call from a constituent, that doesn't count. But if you go to a meeting like this, obviously that counts. Commission meeting day counts. So how did we get here? I love history, but even though I love history, I think it's important to understand how this works. So 1889 is when the state constitution was passed and ratified. That's when Washington became a state, was in 1889. And the issue that deadlocked the state constitutional convention for 2 days that they could not agree on was who owns the submerged lands? Who owns the bed of the harbors? And it was a fight between basically the railroads on one side and the upland business owners and the eastern Washington farmers on the other side. The railroads, of course, wanted to be able to have private sector own the harbors because they already owned them. They wanted to hang on to them. The farmers and some of the business people said, we don't think that's a good idea at all. We think the public should own those, and they should be managed on behalf of the public. And finally, after lots and lots of wrangling that I have a whole other presentation on that got quite interesting, the publicly owned folks prevailed. They carried the day. And so they said the beds of the harbors and the submerged lands of the state are going to be owned by the state. And what happened is they created a group called a Harbor Line Commission to manage it. And guess what happened? The Harbor Line Commission got taken over by the railroads over time. So they came back. And so finally, in 1911, in exasperation, a group of downtown Seattle progressives and Eastern Washington populists, which is basically the Grange, that kind of crowd, they said, we're going to create a separate new form of governance. We're going to create a special district that's governed by people who are elected directly by the people. And we're going to give them a whole bunch of power, and we're going to give them a whole bunch of autonomy, but we're going to make them accountable through elections. It was a very radical idea, and your job was go take the harbors back and manage them for the people. And it's worked, but it was a very radical thing in the day. In fact, probably radical today. So that was how it started with seaports and small boat harbors. And back in the 30s, the only way to get around on Puget Sound was with little boats because the roads were really bad. And so lots of ports on Puget Sound were formed to serve the mosquito fleet, is what they called it, which are the little ferry boats and small packet boats that would go up and down and deliver mail and people and all that. So lots of ports got formed because some place on the water wanted to get connected to the rest of the state, and so they created a little port district. And a lot of you manage the remnants of that system. World War II comes, the Army Air Corps and the Navy built airfields all over the place. World War II ends, they're pulling out of the airports about as fast as they built them. And a lot of these communities said, well, we think that we want to keep our airfield. We're not sure exactly where aviation's going, but we think it's something that we wouldn't need to have in public control. Who's going to manage the airport? Port district said, we'll do it. So ports were given the authority to manage airports. And lots of the airports in the state, by the way, started out as Army Air Corps, which became the Air Force, or Navy airfields. Lots and lots of them. So cities and counties also got the authority to operate airports, so they have the same authority we do. In the 50s, industrial development became popular, and we got the authority to develop industrial development districts, general economic development programs in the 80s, and then a little over 10 years ago, we got the authority to promote tourism, which is kind of a general authority that a number of ports have actually gotten involved in tourism promotion. So what can you do? In this state, you can only do things that the legislature specifically tells you that you can do or that is reasonably implied from that power. So in other words, you can only do what the law tells you have the power to do. That's the limitation. Maybe that's the bad news. The good news is you can do a lot of things. The legislature has said, here's all the things you can do. Provide terminal facilities, airports, warehouses. I'll let you read the list for yourself. You even have the authority to own and operate railroads, and some ports do. You can dredge land, develop land for sale or lease, build and operate marinas and boat ramps, and as I mentioned, tourism facilities. And that's just a sampling. There's even more. The way you raise money is through service charges, leases, and rental fees. You can get grants and gifts. Gifts are fairly rare. Grants are not rare. There are a number of grant programs, state and federal, that ports have the advantage of accessing. You can go in debt through bonds. Bonds come in generally two kinds, general obligation bonds and revenue bonds. And you don't have to try to remember all this today, but a GO bond is a bond that says you pay it back, the full faith and credit of the port. It's basically your property tax levy. It's like when the school district passes a levy. Revenue bonds have a particular revenue stream that comes from a facility, and you say we're going to use the money that facility generates to pay back the bond. You have to have usually a pretty big facility to get a revenue bond. They are out there. We do have revenue bonds. Port of Tacoma, for example, most of our bonds are revenue bonds. But those are the two kinds of bonds that you can get. And then you have tax levies. The primary one is your general port levy, which is fairly small. It's limited to 45 cents per thousand of assessed valuation. So you take the value of the house in thousands, multiply it by 0.0045, and that would be the tax you would get for that. Property taxes always have to be levied uniformly across the district. You can't make one part of the district have a different tax rate than the other ones. Almost all the ports in the state levy a property tax right now. Very few of them are up at 45 cents per thousand. Most of them are lower than that. A couple of ports don't have a tax levy at all. I think there's 3, but most do. And they tend to be used for things that you would use taxes for: transportation projects, environmental cleanup projects, public recreation projects, that sort of thing, generally speaking. When you get your property tax, if you get your little property tax statement in the mail, you look at that little pie chart that has all the different property taxes listed out, you will see the port on there, and it's usually one of the smallest ones. It's usually one little tiny sliver, usually down with like a library district or something like that. It's usually very, very small. But it's a very, very important source of funding for us for infrastructure and other things. There are some special taxes you can levy for dredging and land leveling. They're almost never used. In fact, I'm not sure that they've ever been used. And there's a special tax called an Industrial Development District tax levy. And one of these just got done being passed up in Port Townsend. Is Port Townsend Commissioner here? They just passed it. You probably saw, you were there. That is a very rare occurrence for the voters to approve an Industrial Development District levy. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever seen it before, but I was glad that it happened. And that is a special power that you get. You only get 2 of those. The whole life of the port, you can only levy 2 IDD levies, and I can help you figure out whether or not you've got 1, 2, or 0 left. So return on investment is something that you're going to hear about. How do you guys, what are the citizens getting for the money that we're putting into the port? What do I get back out? Is it worth it? Is it a good investment? Well, there are different ways to think about that. The most obvious one is direct returns, the money that you make from the things that you build and lease. That's obvious. That's black ink, hopefully. And it's easy to hold on to. You can point to the money in your bank account and say, there, we're making that much money off of our marina or off of our airport or whatever it is. Another way to think about it, though, is the indirect returns, which is the revenues that other people make off of your infrastructure investment that help the community out. The businesses, for example, if you have a marina with fishing boats in it, you can say, well, yeah, we actually don't make a ton of money off the fishing boats, but the fishing fleet is really important to our community and the jobs that represents. So we have an indirect return to our community from our investment that we made. And then there's the real soft stuff, the community returns like recreational projects, parks, or environmental projects that have a value, but they're hard to quantify in terms of dollars and cents. But they're undeniably there. So you can say, well, everybody loves that park that the port has down by the water. And we're obviously not going to make much money at it, but it's popular. And we consider that to be a return on the investment that you have at the port. So there's challenges out there. This isn't a complete list, but these are the things that you will come into contact with. One of them is balancing the culture of business with public expectations. Business people, you should make money. You should not be in competition with the private sector, but the community also has expectations about, but I want to have parks. I want to have environmental projects. I want to do things like that. That tension exists pretty much statewide. Environmental impacts can be a big challenge. I can talk all day about environmental issues because I used to work on them. But Jerry O'Keefe, your environmental affairs director, is here in the room. He can answer questions about environmental issues. There's always resistance to tax levies. Nobody likes taxes, and property tax is one of the least popular of the taxes that are out there. You may have competitive pressures with business or even with other ports, depending on the markets that you're in. So if you're working in the world of markets, things happen sometimes that are outside of your control. And that's something that you are probably going to face if you have any kind of a business environment. Transportation investment is hard. You saw a couple of weeks ago how hard it is for transportation projects to get planned long range around the state. We seem to be on a seesaw, a roller coaster when it comes to transportation in this state. We want it, we don't. We want to pay for it, we don't want to pay for it. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. A lot of places have got pressures to gentrify land uses, so there are a number of industrial places around the state. And this doesn't have to be big cities. This can be small cities too, where people retire, they move near an industrial area, they say, I think that industrial area shouldn't be industrial. I like it better when it's a park. I like it better when it's quieter. And this is an old issue, but it is one that I've seen playing out everywhere. It's playing out in downtown Seattle. It's playing out in Bellingham, in Everett, in Port Townsend, Vancouver, Anacortes. It is all over. People say, I like jobs, but I don't necessarily like those jobs. And then access to infrastructure capital. Getting the money to build the fundamental building blocks of infrastructure, whether it's water lines, sewer lines, docks, roads, that money can be hard to come by. And the state of Washington has had a number of partnerships with local governments over the years, but generally speaking, those have diminished. As state revenues have been prioritized more towards education and social services, the traditional kind of infrastructure and cleanup programs that the state used to fund are smaller than they used to be. So when it comes to building things and cleaning things up and getting people around, you are increasingly on your own without help from the state or the federal government. So here are some helpful things for you to remember. As I mentioned, you cannot do anything by yourself. You have to have allies on the commission. You are now a public official in a fishbowl. You need to learn the basics of the Open Public Meetings Act and the Public Records Act, and you're going to. There's a presentation on those, I believe, tomorrow morning. Open Public Meeting Act, which says you have to do everything in public, almost. There's a few things that you can do in what's called executive session, which means behind closed doors. But you can't vote behind closed doors, and there's only certain things you can talk about behind closed doors. And the Public Records Act says, basically, almost all of your records are public to anybody who wants to see them. Your text messages, your emails, voicemail messages, all that kind of stuff. You're going to be surprised when you discover the amount of reach that the Public Records Act is going to have into your port business. Another helpful thing, understand the role of the staff. If you have a staff, work through the executive director. It's confusing if you go around the executive director directly to the staff. And the reason for that is because it confuses the staff. They say, well, doesn't Eric have the support of the commission? Why are they coming to me? Even if you're trying to be helpful, if you say, well, I don't want to bother the director. I know he's busy, and I know it's a marina question. I'm going to call the marina manager because she'll know the answer. Tempting to do, but avoid the temptation. Try to work through your executive director. Things will work better. Because remember, one of the things your executive director has the challenge of is making sure that all the commissioners have the same amount of information at the same time. So you don't have one commissioner getting a whole bunch of information that the other commissioners don't have. That's not a good dynamic. That's not a good dynamic. So in a sense of fairness, you need to be able to say, hey, Commissioner number one asked for this information, which is fine. So I'm going to give Commissioner number one the information, but I'm going to also let Commissioners 2 and 3 know so that they have the benefit of that information too. So it's like, here, just so you know, this got asked, and here was the answer. You get better board dynamics when you do it that way. Another hint, be patient. Government processes take longer than you want them to, especially if you want to build things. Get ready to be amazed at procurement and public works law in particular. It is inefficient, it is slow, you will shake your head, you will gnash your teeth, and that's how the law is set up. It's designed to be slow and a little bit transparent, and so you won't be able to do things as quickly as you want. Another thing to remember, our citizens seem to love process. They love process, and we can't move very quickly in any level of government as a result of that. It takes time to understand your commission colleagues, and it's going to take some time for them to get to understand you. So invest time in listening to them and invest time in explaining your perspective, because eventually it will work out. But it takes a little bit of time. They can't read your mind, and you can't read theirs. But if you invest time in the relationship, it will almost always pay off. The Port Association is a resource for you. It's been established in state law to promote port cooperation and advocacy and education. You've met several of the staff already. There's currently 7 of them. And they're the primary central advocates for you in the legislature and with state agencies and with the governor's office. You're all more powerful together than you are individually. You're far more powerful together than you are individually. And we have a lot of education programs, seminars, conferences. You're sitting in one. These are a really valuable opportunity to meet your colleagues, to meet your peers, to gain contacts with them, because what you're going to discover is the problem and the challenge that you have is probably being faced by another one as well in another port, and you can crosswalk your issues and talk to them. I can't tell you how many friendships I have seen blossom over 30 years with that kind of networking. You'll meet people that you never, you'll meet people from Milwaukee and Clarkston and Ferndale, and you'll learn about their places. It's really, really cool. So there's a lot of tools and training opportunities for you to use and to learn from. It's a pretty vibrant association. And I am done, and I'm happy to answer questions. Unless I've confused you. We're doing okay. Questions, comments? Somebody must have a question. Yeah. Yes. His question was, can Port Commissioner from port number 1, which port are you from, sir? Paulsbo. So he's from Paulsbo. Can you call up a commissioner at the Port of Kingston and chat with them about stuff? Absolutely. Absolutely you can. There's no prohibition to port number 1 and port number 2 talking to each other. What you can't do is have you and one of your colleagues on the Paulsbo Commission go talk to another commissioner, because then there's 2 of you on the 3-member board. That's a quorum. That's a meeting. You're going to get into all this, but it's really awkward with three commissioners, because basically you can't do port business with another one of your colleagues unless you're in the public. It's anti-intuitive and a little bit clumsy, but it's the law. I saw a hand over here. Yeah, Troy.
So along with that, if you're emailing another port, you're using the port email.
Yeah, we'll get into all that. So if somebody sends an email to all 3 commissioners and you hit reply all, you just had a meeting and it's documented. So don't do that. So there's a big, long training thing. Don't panic. We'll get you as trained up as we can on the do's and don'ts of the Public Records Act and the Open Public Meetings Act. The OPMA in particular is real easy to get tripped up on accidentally. Real easy to get tripped up on accidentally. So you just got to be really careful about it. It's rarely violated willfully, but it can be violated accidentally. And so we've got some really good training for that you're going to hear about in a minute. Yeah, Dave.
So I don't know how to pose this question, but I will pose it anyway. We'll talk about competition between ports. Can a port try to do a project in another port?
Good question. So his question was, if you couldn't hear him, can a port do a project in cooperation with another port or another port's area?
Just for a state that the state is doing a project
Mm-hmm.
in your port. Can another city, another port, reach out to that state?
The simple answer to the question is, you can work outside of your port district area if there is another port there and they are in agreement with you, if you have an interlocal agreement. Okay, so, and I believe actually, I have to look this up, I believe you have to be adjacent to each other. I believe you have to be next to each other. I don't think you can hop over a county and have port number 1 and port number 3 cooperate if their boundaries don't touch. But yes, there are examples of ports that have cooperated on the projects. The ports of Chelan County and Douglas County, which is Wenatchee and East Wenatchee, for years have jointly operated Pangbourne Field, which is the airport there in East Wenatchee. And in fact, those ports just got done taking another step, which is they didn't merge, but they have coordinated their activities with an interlocal agreement, so they're essentially now being managed under one set of staff, even though each of the 2 commissions retain all of their authorities. Okay, so that's the Seaport Alliance between the Port of Seattle and Tacoma is a little bit similar to that as well. But there have been, I could give you examples of places where port has said, hey, we've got a project that we think would be a good idea. It's inside of your district. Can we cooperate on it? And if you sign an interlocal agreement and everybody's on the same page, the answer is yes. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Her question is industrial development district tax levies, what are they used for? They have traditionally been used for buying land and putting in infrastructure such as roads and sewer and water, sometimes docks or ramps, boat ramps, that kind of thing. Breakwaters, another big one. So, for example, in Bellingham, if you're familiar with Bellingham, that Squalicum area down there, where that was built with a couple of IDD levies back in the 60s. I could think of other ones too. The Port of Port Townsend's was all infrastructure, boat ramps and breakwaters and airport improvements. It's basically hard things that help create jobs. Is the answer. Yep. And when you form an IDD, we can answer all those questions later, but you have to actually have a resolution. You have to form a boundary. There's processes that you go through. I saw a hand over here. I thought. Did I see a hand over here? No. Other? Yeah. Well, there's a few other things like, railroads and that sort of thing, but I don't think that's what you're talking about. It's mostly, did you hear the question? I'm sorry. The question was, in addition to those four basic things that ports have most traditionally done, seaports, airports, marinas, and industrial properties, what other sorts of things besides tourism have ports gotten involved in? I would say that 99% of the things I can think of fall into one of those categories, with the understanding that you've got an awful lot of flexibility. For example, tourism. What does that mean, right? Several ports recently have done what I would call pretty significant waterfront revitalization efforts in their community, where they have brought in hotels. They have brought in or leased property to hotels, leased property to commercial operations, restaurants, and so forth. Kalama comes to mind. If you've been to Kalama lately, the downtown Kalama area has really been rather transformed by the Port of Kalama with what I would call a waterfront revitalization type of program, where they've put in a long linear park. They've got a McMenamin's Lodge there. They've put in an amphitheater where they have concerts and so on. And it's pretty, they've got volleyball courts and that kind of thing. And it's become a kind of a community center. Everett is doing a similar thing in downtown Everett with that, I can't remember the name of that, what do you call that, Marina District? Waterfront Place, that's it. And they're embarking on a somewhat similar operation with that kind of waterfront redevelopment. So that's, is that economic development? I would say it probably is. There are people in Kalama who have jobs 12 months a year now because of those investments that have been made that didn't have jobs before, right, Troy? So I would call that economic development. Now you've got a decision on your hands about the limited amount of money that you have and what kind of jobs you want to try to create with it. So there's always trade-offs and discussion about that. Are we interested in really high-wage jobs? Are we interested in entry-level jobs? And there's no right answer to that question. That's the judgment of the commissioners. But Kristen, did I answer your question? I don't know if I really did. I mean, there's some other things too that can be affiliated with airports. The Port of Seattle has plowed into the cruise business, right? With all that investment for cruise ships that come in. The port doesn't actually make a ton of money on themselves off the dockage and so on, but the community and the state make a, pardon the pun, boatload of money off of that with the money that gets recycled through there. So those things are a jackpot for the region, dollars and cents wise, even if they're not a jackpot for the Port of Seattle. That's an example of that indirect return that I talked about in that one slide. Yeah. No. That's a really interesting question, and it's a really, it's been talked about quite a bit. This is an issue that is a fairly significant one statewide, not just for ports, but there, housing availability is a fundamental economic development input. If you don't have good middle market housing, you aren't going to attract investment into your community because they're going to come and say, well, I'd love to bring my 200 people to your town, but where are they going to live, right? And that is happening in Wenatchee. It's happening in even Moses Lake. It's happening in Walla Walla. It's happening in a number of places around the state. And a lot of people are talking about it. And this association actually entered into a kind of a partnership with the Association of Washington Business, the Association of Cities, the Association of Counties, to start developing forums to bring people together to talk about that. We had realtors and land use planning people and FutureWise, and so I'm really headed out kind of around the planet here to answer your question. But the answer is housing availability is a fundamental economic development input. A lot of people are talking about what to do about that. Ports do not have the authority to provide housing, so that's not on the list. We can't do it. As the issue has come up over the years, when the question has been asked of the ports collectively, do you want that authority? The answer has been no, thank you. We don't want that authority because we think that our job is to create jobs. And if we create enough jobs, people can afford houses. Okay, so we're not a housing authority. We have housing authorities in the state. That's not us. So let's work with them to see if they can, what we can do to help them out. So that's how the issue has evolved up to this point. It's not going away. I can guarantee you that the issue of housing affordability will be talked about in Olympia come January. Sometimes ports get pulled into that discussion, sometimes they don't. But it is a very, very topical issue right now. Yeah. Another question? No? Okay, let's move.